Have you ever felt like you're in a transitional period in your life where something's changed on the inside, something's shifted, and you can't quite put your finger on what it is, but something has definitely changed? Today, I'm going to be sharing on how do we navigate transitions in life, because one thing is true about life: everything is always changing around us continually. In fact, according to Google, it says research so people spend nearly half of their adult life in transitional phases. In fact, there's in parentheses this word I've never heard of. It says, I've never heard these words put together: life quake. Life quake. Every 12 to 18 months on average, almost half of these life quakes are driven by positive events like marriage, having children, or career advancements. So every 12 to 18 months on average as adults, we experience some type of significant change. Maybe that's where you find yourself out today. Maybe you've been in the same, had the same career path year after year, decade after decade, and now you find yourself no longer wanting to be there. You feel like uh, everything's the same, and yet you're not the same, and you feel like a stranger in a foreign land. It no longer feels like the place that you're supposed to be. That's what I want to share about today. How do we navigate transitions in a healthy way? I remember back in 2012, my wife and I and our family, we were going to a church. I would say it was my home church. We've been going there for a number of years. We got married there. And all of a sudden I showed up and something shifted on the inside. Everything externally was the same. We pulled up in the same parking lot, probably parked in a similar spot, sat in a similar seat, and yet something changed. The only thing that changed looking back was something on the inside of me. And here's what I know to be true now. I was entering in a transitional period of my life where that wasn't the spot that God had for us anymore. I think sometimes it's challenging, to say the least, when it comes to transitions, because it's not too uncommon. If if somebody's a believer of Jesus, it's not too uncommon for somebody to pray about and have a sense of direction that they're going for their life. And I remember just having no doubt that's where my family and I was supposed to be. And so, like, what changed? Is God bipolar? Did he change his mind? No, not at all. In fact, there's a time in scripture when it's Abraham and his son Isaac, where God tells him to go to the top of the mountain and to sacrifice his son. And so Abraham obeys God, takes his son to the top of the mountain, and yet God speaks again and tells him, do not sacrifice your son, and gives him a goat or a sheep to sacrifice instead. And it's like, hold on a second. God told him, and yet then God gave further instructions. So it's not listening to God is enough. We have to keep listening, keep hearing, because sometimes the instruction orders change. So if you find yourself in a transitional period of your life, stay tuned, because I'm going to share how do we recognize we're in a transitional period, and then more importantly, what do we do about it? How do we navigate that in a healthy way? I wrote this down. Disappointment can happen when I expect everything to remain the same. Disappointment, frustration, bitterness, all of that can set in when I expect things to stay the same. Think about it when it comes to work. I could find myself in a disappointed spot, meaning I thought it was going to go a different direction. And I think it's important to acknowledge when we're in a transitional period. That's actually one of the key steps that I wrote down in my notes, to acknowledge we're in a transitional period, because what happens otherwise, disappointment and frustration could set in. When I'm silently disappointed and frustrated, sometimes that can lead to bitterness, where I get to an unhealthy spot. It's where I start to withdraw from family members and friends because I just get all twisted up and confused and frustrated on the inside. So the good news is that if you're in a transitional period, number one, you're not alone. I've been there many times throughout my life. And yet, I would encourage you with this, that there's benefits to transitions. There's benefits to changing season in your life, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. I remember there's a story about eagles. Eagles, they fly higher than any other bird, from what I understand. And with eagles, they don't make a little robin-sized nest like the birds in the backyard of my house. They make these huge, massive nests. Have you ever seen those blue pools that they used to sell at like Walmart and Kmart? Maybe they still do. They're those hard plastic ones, like my grandma and mom used to buy them during the summertime. And I mean, the eagle's nest are like that big. So just imagine 5 or 6 feet in circumference or diameter, whatever it's called. They're huge, is my point, and heavy. They weigh hundreds of pounds. Massive nest, and the mom bird will give birth to the baby eagles and the eggs, and then eventually the eagles hatch out of the eggs. The mom provides nourishment, protection, provision, all of those things for the baby eagles. And guess what eventually happens? The eagles mature and grow, and eventually they get to the edge of the nest, they spread their wings for the first time, and they jump out and fly. However, once in a while, do you know what happens? One of those baby eagles, for whatever reason, does not jump out of the nest and spread its wings and fly. So what does the mom eagle do then when the baby eagle doesn't want to leave the nest? The nest of familiarity, comfort, provision, protection. What does the mom eagle do at that point? Here's what she does. They start taking the bottom of the nest and they start turning those twigs upwards. So the twigs, they poke the baby eagle until it's so uncomfortable that guess what the baby eagle finally does? Gets to the edge of the nest, jumps out and spreads its wings for the first time. It can become so uncomfortable that the baby eagle finally jumps out of the nest. And if I look at my life, and I wonder if you look at yours, because I bet we're the same. Sometimes it takes an extreme amount of discomfort, frustration to trust God to take that step, to enter that transition period, or do the thing that we know we need to do. So sometimes it has to get uncomfortable. So I believe transitional periods are periods of change. It's uncomfortable. It's unfamiliar. It's going to the land that we don't know. There's a time in scripture where God tells, I believe it's Abraham, go to the land I'll show you. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine if you came home from work and you told your loved ones, hey, I got a U-Haul, we're packing. Number one, they're like, what's going on? Number two, they're like, where are we going? And you say, I don't know yet, but we're going to go. And perhaps I'll know it when we get there. Like that would just be wild. So I think transitional periods of our life, they're always uncomfortable. And there will be a temptation to get frustrated and bitter and resentful. And yet I want to encourage you with this, that this transitional period, this change happening, it's happening for you, not to you. You're not a victim of what's happening. According to God, you're a victor. Now, I'm not trying to sound like Joe Osteen because I think he has a book on that. And yet my point is, my personal belief that God has a plan and purpose regardless of this transitional period, regardless if you've asked for it or not, regardless of how uncomfortable it feels. I believe that God offers hope. He offers the security and the comfort knowing that he is God. I think as human beings, I want security. I want safety. I want predictability. And I think what's challenging about transitional periods, if I think about it, is they're uncomfortable. So don't get bitter. Don't get resentful. Embrace the attitude that this is happening for you, not to you. God has your best intention. He has your best. He's looking out for your best interest. That's the bottom line. I think God's more interested in our personal growth and maturity, developing as a human being made in his image. I think he's more interested in us becoming a mature man or woman of God, really more than anything else. So here's some benefits of change. I wrote down 3 benefits of change in my notes that I'd like to share. Number 1 is change or transitions in life can draw out your potential. It'll draw out your potential. What do I mean by potential? I believe that here's where I'm at in my life, and here's all that I could be and all that God has for me. The messy middle, that is the opportunity to rise up to become the man or woman of God that he's created you to be. And we're not quite that person yet. Otherwise, we would already be that person. So there's maturing, there's growing that has to happen. I was at a coaches conference, some training in Atlanta, Georgia, a number of years ago. And there's one main thing that I remember from all of this training, and it was like a 3 or 4 day event. It's this, that you don't get to move on to the next season until you learn the lesson. So one of the questions I have for you, have you learned the lesson in that career or in that relationship? Write down the lesson that you learned, because perhaps maybe it's true for you. You don't get to move forward to next until you learn the lesson. I remember I launched my real estate business in 2007. Prior to that, I worked as a part-time EMT fireman, worked in a nursing home, passing out medication to little old people, and I had a landscaping business as well. I was doing all of those things prior to real estate. And yet I loved real estate the most. That's where my heart and my real passion was. And I honestly got to a point to where I got a little bitter and resentful, to say the least, meaning the job that I had, instead of my passion of being an entrepreneur and business owner in real estate, I let it get to a point where I started showing up to work bitter and resentful. I didn't want to be there in the first place, and I was just there for the paycheck, and I didn't really want to be there. And I look back because there was one lesson that I learned. And it's like, once I learned that lesson, I was able to move past go and collect $200. Now, that's a Monopoly reference for passing go. And yet, here's the lesson that I learned. I'll share it with you, is this: that my job is to serve people with a great attitude, help them. And so, guess what? I took that lesson and I started to apply it to the job that I was frustrated at, that I didn't want to be at. And guess what? Nothing changed in those organizations. The only change that happened was on the inside of me with my attitude. So sometimes the change that we think we need is to move our feet and go somewhere else. That could be true. But also sometimes the change we need is the change of my heart, the change of the attitude that I'm choosing to have, because I get to choose my attitude, no one else. So I wonder, sometimes when it comes to a transition period, maybe it's not that it's time to go anywhere. Maybe my attitude and what I do needs to change at the place I'm currently at. However, without a doubt, sometimes it is time to pack bags and go to next. It's not just an attitude shift or change. Now, what's funny about that story, it was shortly after that, I never went back again. It's like, once I learned the lesson that I'm there to serve people, serve God, have a good attitude, and take care of these people the best I can with all my ability, it's like I was able to transition to full time into my career of being an entrepreneur, being a real estate business owner now. It's funny looking back because that's 17 or 18 years ago at this point. So transitions, they could be uncomfortable, that we could have a holy dissatisfaction where we know on the inside something shifted or changed. And change can draw out your potential. Number two, change challenges your potential. In order to become more, there's a process. And the process is uncomfortable. It reminds me of training for a race. I got into becoming a triathlete. So essentially, I went from being a couch potato, no races, to doing like 12 or 14 races in a row per year. And what I learned about that, it's not so much about crossing the finish line, because that's so brief. It happens so quick. The real magic happens as an athlete in the process, embracing the process of becoming the type of person who can do the thing. So when it comes to a transition or a change in our life, it will challenge us to become more. Because when we become more, we could do more, therefore have more. My personal belief is that we're made in God's image, according to Genesis chapter 1, I believe it is, and that our life really should be getting progressively better. Things are changing all around us. Nothing is staying the same. Things are either moving towards decay and destruction, or things are getting better. There's no standing still. So in order to when it comes to embracing change or transitions, it will draw out your potential. It will challenge you to become more, which means to pursue your potential. And then the next one that I wrote down is that change can help you to become who God intends you to be. It will help you become the person God intends you to be. One of the things I learned from John Maxwell is that there's no connection between age, the number, and maturity. Just because somebody gets older in years, year after year, does not mean that they continue to mature and grow. I have another podcast episode where I interview a gentleman that's a mentor of mine, David Higginbotham, and it has maturity in the title. Like, maturity is optional. Just because we get older in age, the number, doesn't mean my maturity and growth happens. It's optional. I play a key role in my maturity and my growing of understanding who God is and who I am because of him. So change can help me become who God intends me to be. Those are some benefits of change. Those are 3 benefits of change. Next, I want to get into the 3 ways, like the 3 steps, if you will, to navigate change. 3 steps to navigate change. The first one I wrote down is to acknowledge that you think you're in a transitional period of your life. Don't deny it. Don't get frustrated. Don't get bitter. Don't fall into being a victim, meaning you're pointing your finger at your coworkers, your spouse, or don't be a victim. Don't point fingers at other people and blame them. Acknowledge that you're in a transitional period. Change is on the horizon. Change is here. Acknowledge it. Don't run from it. Don't be a victim and blame others. Step number 2 is submit yourself to God. Now that sounds real spiritual, and yet I want to break it down because it does have practical meaning. It's one of the things I love about the Bible is that the Bible has principles for life. These principles are so good. I've read so many personal growth and development books over the years where it's like they highlight biblical principles and yet they don't tie it into a verse or a story from scripture. And yet there's so much wisdom found in scripture that I believe that principles are so good and they work so well, it really doesn't matter if you believe or not. And yet when it comes to the second step after acknowledging that you're in a transitional period, it's this: submit yourself to God. What do I mean by that? Come under the authority of God. Now, maybe you've never heard of that before, or maybe that's familiar language. Here's what that means: acknowledge that God is God, I am not. Sometimes I know it sounds super basic, and yet sometimes as human beings, especially when we're having the success we desire, we're crushing our goals and all of those types of things, sometimes it's easy to lose track. When everything's going well, it's easy to think that, you know what, it's like, man, I've put in the work. I'm following my plan. I'm setting goals. I have a coach. I'm doing all these things right. Therefore, it's because of me. So it's helpful to be reminded that to come underneath God's authority. What does that look like? It looks like this. It's more of the posture, an attitude in my heart that I have. It's an attitude I have, an approach to my life. So to submit to the authority of God, it means this: God, you are God. You are the creator. I'm the created. You're God. I'm not. You're the king. I'm your son or daughter. Like it's that type of remembering who God is and who you are because of him. So after acknowledging that you're in a transitional period, acknowledge or submit to the authority of God. Come up under his authority, meaning he's God. Thank you, God, for being God. Thank you for the partnership that I have with you. And then number 3 is ask. Ask for wisdom. That's what I mean by ask. Ask for wisdom. There's a verse in Matthew that says, keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking. That doesn't mean that we need to be repetitive in our asking, meaning if I sense a change is on the horizon in my career, I don't need to keep asking them day after day, minute by minute, the same thing again and again. That means whatever needs that you have, keep bringing the needs, the questions, the concerns, the anxiety, the fear, whatever it is, keep bringing that to God. Ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open. I love that there's a rhythm there. It's like God and me. God, I can't do God's part. I surely can't do his part. And so he has a part he plays. I have a part I play. I can't do his part. And he definitely isn't going to do my part. It's the co-partnership, us together. So I would say this: if you feel like you're in a transitional phase in your life, acknowledge it, remind yourself, submit yourself to God, meaning he's God, you're not, and then ask him for help. One of my favorite scriptures, meaning passages in the Bible, it says this: that if any man lacks wisdom, if you lack understanding, let that person ask God and he'll give it to you. He's not going to withhold it from you. He will give it to you. And so I think one of the keys that unlocks what's next during a transition is the posture of the heart, surrender, meaning God, you have a plan. You're God. I'm not. I'm in a transitional period. Things are changing around me. Will you show me the next step to take? Ask for the next step. Man, I wish I could tell you like there's a verse or there's a way for God to lay out the entire plan that he has for your life. I suppose maybe he's done that for somebody before, and yet he's never done that for me. He's never shown me the master game plan that he has for my life. And yet, you know what he's been faithful to do? He's been faithful every single time to show me the one next step to take. He'll show you the one next step to take. So maybe the wisdom that you ask for in that third step is asking God to show you exactly the one next step to take. Here's what I love about transition periods looking back. It's neat to see God's protection, how he protects me, how he provides for me, and how he takes care of me. Sometimes a transition period can feel confusing or lost or stuck or frustrated. And yet, here's what I'll tell you. Press in right now. Don't give up. Don't get discouraged. Don't get defeated. Ask God to show you what that next step is. And I don't know where you're going to get your answer from on what's next. I don't. I don't know what that next step is. I don't know what the master plan is. I don't know what he has for you. And yet it's going to be neat looking back 12, 24, 36 months from now. When you get some perspective, it'll be more clear on why this period of your life was so important for you to go through to become the type of person God has you to become for you and your family. One of my favorite things to encourage people with is this, that no matter what's going on in your life, no matter how challenging things may seem, that God absolutely, without a doubt, has a plan and purpose for your life. It says this, it says, God has a plan and purpose to prosper you, to give you a hope and a future, an expected ending, meaning God has good plans for you. So including my thoughts today, I trust that you've been challenged, meaning that you've identified one thing that you can do better in, or the one next thing that you can do. And I trust that this has been helpful to remind you that there is untapped potential inside of you. You're not all that God has in store for you to become quite yet. So I like to remind myself, I'm just a man on the journey. I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have to have it all figured out. And yet God will show you the one next step to take. We don't know how he's going to answer and show you that step. So I'd encourage you to pay attention to everything and everyone. What do I mean by that? I've had it to where I've received confirmation of the next thing to do by a bumper sticker or by the license plate in the car in front of me. There's been times, just being honest, where I'll be driving and I'll see a license plate that has a verse on it. And I don't know what that verse is. So carefully, of course, I'll take out my cell phone and I'll capture a picture of that license plate and go and look it up, and come to find out that verse will speak to me and be relative to that particular moment in my life. So we don't know how God's going to speak to you. He's not limited. So just start paying attention to everything. One of the things that he does that I just love, he usually brings someone into my life. He brings a who into my life. I remember in 2015, I was stuck in my business, getting the same results year after year, until this gentleman from the Pacific Northwest, Bend, Oregon to be exact, named Rick DeLuca, who came down to the Kansas City area and spoke at the Coldwell Banker in Raymore I was at. And man, it was just like everything he said was resonating with where I was at in my life and in my business. And it was just like he was the right person at the right time saying exactly what I needed to hear. It's like when the student is ready, the teacher appears. It's amazing how that works. The reason I bring up Rick is because he actually became my first business coach. So one of the reasons that I'm passionate about developing people and helping them move towards entrepreneurship or launching the business or the organization that they're passionate about is because of Rick and how he helped simplify my business to help me serve more people and get some of my time back and stop working 7 days a week. Thank God for Rick DeLuca. Clearly, he sent Rick into my life. Another gentleman, I've interviewed him a few times on my podcast channel, and he's going to be coming down January 16th, 2025 to speak at Elevate in Kansas City again. This time it's going to be at Life Quest Church in Belton. Shout out to my buddy Chris Pinion for letting us use his beautiful facility. And Chris is going to be one of the keynote speakers. We're bringing in David Higginbottom from Texas, and he's going to be sharing about how do you build a business and have a thriving family. Because sometimes people think like, man, you could either have a great family or a great business. You can't really have both. No, you actually can have both. It's going to require intentionality and effort. And yet, invite to you. That's going to be January 16th. David Higginbottom. David Higginbottom came in my life about 2012, I believe it was. And David started to help me when it comes to being well, he became a friend. And yet, our conversations are usually around being a husband and being a father. And so I can look and see how God sent Rick DeLuca to help me with my business. He sent David Higginbottom to help me with being a husband and father. I learned from a mentor or a coach of mine, Abraham Sharif in Ogden, Utah, that if I'm doing something by myself, if I'm building a business by myself, I may be making it harder than it needs to be. And so I would share that idea with you. Perhaps the reason that your business feels hard, or being a husband, a father, or mother, or friend feels hard, maybe you got to a point where you doing it by yourself is no longer the wisest thing to do. Sometimes people are like, Chris, like, man, it's going well. I'm like, perfect. And yet, if you ever get to a spot in your life where the relationship isn't going well, the business isn't going well, that may be the time to be open to changing things. My whole point in bringing up Abraham Sharif, David Higginbottom, Rick DeLuca, those people that have came in my life at the right time, is I really believe that God always sends somebody into our life at the right time to help us to get to where we desire to go, to get us. They will help us move towards the plan and purpose God has for us. So I would say, ask if you feel like you're missing a who. Ask God ask God to send someone, and then pay attention to who He sends. Earlier this year, I'm reflecting on 2024 now that it's December, and I'm thinking about a friendship has changed. There's a gentleman I met up for year after year, and we just don't meet anymore. Does that mean that he doesn't like me and I don't like him? No, not at all. Something shifted. The frequencies changed. And yet, you know what? There's been a new friendship with a gentleman named Brian Bowers. Thank God for Brian Bowers. 72, 73 years old. And he reminds me of John Maxwell so much, where he's focused on adding value to others. So I trust this has been helpful. Be encouraged and yet challenged as well. Press in, take action. God's not going to do the work for you. You have to do it for yourself. And yet He doesn't leave you alone. Comment. I would love to hear from you. Send me a message. If you got a question, if there's something that's unclear, send me a message or comment, and I'll reply back when I see your message. We'll see you.